Now, this lecture really grows out of a book which I wrote some time ago. Most of the research for it was actually done in the 90s and was published in the millennial year, 2000, by Yale University Press. And this was the year before 9/11. And I think it's really fascinating to reflect on how the situation East-West has got a lot more complicated since that time, but also the interest in Islamic studies in the West has grown enormously since that time. In fact, my book spawned two very interesting exhibitions. One called Venice in the Islamic World, which was in Paris, New York, and Venice, and another one, Bellini in the East, which was in London and Boston. So even just that this small area of contact between Venice and the Islamic world, this is quite it's a sort of a field that's aroused a lot of interest, so I hope you'll find it interesting. I actually was very perplexed before I began this project by how the official histories always talk about tensions, because all the official documents are all about problems, extortion, violence, war, problems of customs, and so on and so forth. And actually, if you read the documents of travellers and merchants and so on who are actually mixing with Muslims in the Islamic world, they were much more open and friendly and much more knowledgeable and much more warm, really, about their Muslim colleagues than the official documents suggest. So this is really the experience that I had from this project. Now, I have a completely Eurocentric point of view, and I apologise for that, but it's quite difficult for me to be otherwise, especially since my attempts at learning Arabic were rather unsuccessful. So let's start anyway, and I'm sure you might have some questions, so we can talk about things later maybe. Now, Charles Dickens, the English writer, in a letter to a friend in 1844, wrote this: "My dear fellow, nothing in the world you've ever heard of Venice is equal to the magnificent and stupendous reality. The wildest visions of the Arabian Nights are nothing to the Piazza of St. Mark and the first impressions of the inside of the church. The gorgeous and wonderful reality of Venice is beyond the fantasy of the wildest dreamer. Opium couldn't build such a place, and enchantment couldn't shadow it forth in a vision." So my question is, why does Venice seem exotic and oriental, in inverted commas, to the European visitor? Now, of course, European medieval culture envisaged paradise in the East. The four rivers of paradise in the book of Genesis are all obviously in the East, and it was the source of light. Light rises in the East, sun rises in the East, physical and spiritual light, and also a source of exotic and very precious commodities, as well as a great deal of scientific knowledge and medical expertise and so on. So orientation in our language is a positive word. If you're disorientated, you're in an unhappy situation. Now, this is a slightly unfair comparison, but these are two medieval miniatures. This one is a picture of Venice showing Marco Polo setting off on his travels by a London illuminator with a studio on London Bridge, who probably had never been to Venice, but he'd heard about it. And this is a miniature of Baghdad in flood, which makes it look a bit more like Venice, probably, than it normally does. But I put these up just to remind you that I think to a medieval traveller, Venice would indeed have seemed very much like many medieval great Islamic cities. One Venetian art historian, Giuseppe Fiocco, once described it as a colossal souk. And the sort of qualities that you find in both these kinds of cities are very densely built up, labyrinthine inhabited quarters, very bustling markets, cosmopolitan crowds, a very prosperous merchant class, a lot of rich colour and detail in the buildings, very private little courtyards, glimpses over crenellated walls, exotic skylines, all these sort of features. So I'm going to look at some of the borrowings that I think one can find in Venetian architecture that seem to come from Islamic sources, and think about what they were supposed to mean, why these particular things were borrowed. And I really would like to underline that I think, it's never been more important for us to understand the sort of rich and extraordinary history, really, of these cross-cultural contacts. Could I take my jacket off? So, one finds around the city some very blatant and quite strange signs of contact with the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the most picturesque is this group of a sort of quartet of turbaned figures on the outside of a house in the northern part of the city, which seem to be actually religious figures that have had turbans added, because the turbans are in different stones, you can see there. In fact, the niche in this case had to be widened out to make room for the turban. It's quite sort of wonky. But this really picturesque little quartet, like something out of a comic opera, are really to advertise the fact that the person who lived in the house had a spice business at the Rialto market and imported spices from the Arab world. So this is a sort of it's rather like having a shop for Chinese imports and hanging Chinese lanterns or something in your shop. I mean, it's a very obvious sign. Likewise, this delightful camel, who sadly is being pulled by a man who seems to have had a leg broken off. Oops, you can see there. But is on a nearby house where, again, the owner was a merchant. So these are very obvious signs because they're so incongruous and unexpected, but I'm really wanting to look at slightly more subtle signs of Eastern influence than this. And I think you can compare this with, learning a language. You can learn a language properly and it just sort of comes in through the pores, but if you're imitating it deliberately, it becomes more sort of comic and blatant like that. Just another example of this sort of thing is this strange object, which is believed by Venetians to be the throne of St. Peter. It can't be the throne of St. Peter because it's an Islamic tombstone that's been mounted into a throne, and it says around the outside, "Show us thy mercy, Allah, the noblest one of those who show mercy." So clearly St. Peter lived long before Islam, so it just shows the kind of confusion that this sort of thing could provoke. And you probably won't be able to read this, but these are some of the words in Venetian dialect that have Arab origins, and they're all connected with either trade or war or sort of luxury living. Those seem to be the main areas of interaction. Now I'm going to go chronologically through the lecture and just talk about how Venetian contacts with the Islamic world grew and the kind of cultural impacts that they had. So we'll start with the sort of beginnings of Venetian trade, and just to set the context, really, if we think about the Mediterranean world in 830, and you'll see why that's significant in a moment. At that time, that's just after the time of Charlemagne, so the Western Empire is very powerful. The Byzantine Empire is shrinking, and all of Spain and North Africa and all around here, all of those areas are, by this time, Muslim caliphates of various kinds. Now, in the year 829, the year before this, two Venetian merchants smuggled the body of St. Mark from its burial place in Alexandria and brought it to Venice, where it was where a church, not a cathedral actually, it is now the cathedral, but it wasn't then, a church was built to house the body. This beautiful mosaic from a later period shows the church already finished, which of course it wasn't in 829, but you can see the body being brought in. And what I want to underline is that the fact that they were able to smuggle it out means that their presence in Alexandria was not all that surprising. There were already Venetian merchants there. In fact, the Doge at the time had investments in ship voyages and had Eastern goods in his house. And the leading families in Venice were not landowners, as in most European countries at this time, but they were merchants, and they had a very mercantile mentality. And already at this time, objects were coming from the Islamic world, regarded as so precious that they were often put into the treasury of St. Mark's and disguised as Christian objects by being mounted in sort of Byzantine-style mounts. So this beautiful blue glass vase has been made into some sort of, apparently made to look like a religious object, and this is a very fine piece of rock crystal which belonged to Al-Aziz Billah from the Fatimid period, and again it's been turned into a sort of vessel for communion wine or something like that and put in the treasury of St. Mark's. But these appropriations were made because these were so obviously such beautiful and fine pieces of and precious pieces of craftsmanship. Now, obviously, you can't look at this subject without looking at the Crusades, and this is obviously a delicate area. But what I would like to stress is that the Venetians didn't really want Crusades at all, because they wanted to protect very good relationships with their Muslim trading partners, and Crusades really messed this up, as you can imagine. So, when Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099 and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was set up, Venice, ever opportunistic, looked at the situation carefully and decided to take advantage and began to set up trading posts in this new Christian kingdom in what I suppose one would call, in Christian terms, one would call the Holy Land. And from this moment on, the Knights Templars, who were who were looking after the Temple Mount, and which had been seized, of course, thought it was the Temple of Solomon. Thought that the Dome of the Rock was the Temple of Solomon. I mean, we know it isn't, but they firmly believed this, and the image of the Solomonic associations with this building proved to be very enduring. And Solomon, of course, was a figure renowned for wisdom and justice in the Bible, and so the Venetians found this Solomonic imagery represented the sort of virtues that they wanted to claim for their own republic, their own government. So there's a sort of tremendous interest in borrowing elements from the identity of the supposed Temple of Solomon in order to underline the wisdom and justice of the republic. This church here, which is on an island off the main part of Venice, the island of Torcello, was a small little Byzantine church, and in the 11th century, which is when the Knights Templars were here on the Temple Mount, this octagonal arcade with very tall stilted arches was added around the outside, and I think it's very likely that a reference was intended, deliberate reference was intended. I can't prove this, but if you knew that and saw that, you might well make a connection. Sorry, I'm in your way. I can move the... No. Okay. Well, here's another example of this, really. This is a woodcut of Jerusalem from the late 15th century, where the Dome of the Rock is actually labelled Templum Salomonis, the Temple of Solomon. And I'm suggesting that this beautiful Baroque church in Venice, which was built dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who was presented at the Temple of Solomon, and the feast of this church is on the presentation of the Virgin, is actually again a memory of this idea of the Dome of the Rock as the Temple of Solomon. Now, the Fourth Crusade was a very strange event. By this time, the, quote, Holy Land had been recovered by the Muslims, and another crusade set off in 1204. And the Venetians provided the ships. When they got to Constantinople, I think they realized that the Crusaders were never going to be able to pay for these ships, and they were going to be in a bad financial situation. So they decided to sack Constantinople, which was the Byzantine capital, and brought back lots of trophies from Constantinople instead. And here are some of the details, and they were all displayed on the side of St. Mark's that faces the water, so that incoming travellers would be impressed by all these beautiful different kinds of marble. We don't know marble nearly as well as people did in this period. I mean, if you would recognise where all these marbles came from, these two beautiful pillars come from a church in Constantinople. And these beautiful porphyry tetrarchs also were pillaged from the same place. Now, as a result of the sort of triumph over the Byzantine world, the Venetians, who had been a kind of offshore colony of Byzantium, gradually began to express their independence. And they did this by beginning to assert connections with Egypt. Now, this was partly because, of course, they now had the body of St. Mark, who had been martyred in Alexandria, but also because they were developing very important trading routes with Egypt, and I think had a very direct experience of this place. So you find signs of that in the mosaics. For example, St. Mark's is a Byzantine-style Greek cross church. The body of St. Mark is under here. And originally it had a rather narrow atrium, but in the 13th century, after Fourth Crusade, this was extended around here. And so the cycle of mosaics, which follows the Bible, starts with the creation, the flood, and so on, Abraham. And then there are 3 cupolas with the story of Joseph. And Joseph, most of the story of Joseph happens in Egypt. And then one of Moses, who also had strong connections with Egypt. And some of the illustrations show scenes of merchant life. I mean, Venetian merchants, when they were trading in the East, would dress, were allowed actually by trading treaties to dress in the style of the locals and travel around with so-called caravans, groups of merchants with camels carrying their stuff overland, in scenes very reminiscent of this. So this is Joseph brought into Egypt, and they use the word mercatoribus in the caption, which you can't see, which of course means merchants. And I've suggested that they were in fact probably familiar with these beautiful Islamic illuminations from the particular series of wonderful stories about merchant life, the Makhamat of Al-Hariri. You'll know how to pronounce it better than I do. There is a number of manuscripts of this, but I think that they were certainly acquiring books of this kind, because a lot of the ways in which they depict camels and figures and so on in these mosaics are very similar. It's not the only source, but I think it's quite an important one. Another sort of curiosity is that in the story of Joseph was told by God that there would be a famine and that he should save up grain for 7 good years for the 7 years of famine that would follow. And it was believed in the Middle Ages that the pyramids in Giza in Egypt were Joseph's barns. Well, if any of you have seen the pyramids, and there's no space inside, they're more or less solid, there's just a little sort of tunnel at the bottom, you couldn't hold much grain in there. But the myth was certainly very much alive, and so that the spectator in Venice would look at that and really feel they were seeing a scene from Egypt. An interesting thing that happened at this time was that they began to try to make St. Mark's look more Islamic on the outside as well. St Mark had been buried in Egypt, and they looked at burial structures in Egypt, such as this view of Cairo, the city of the dead, and tried to make the domes of St Mark look more like it. Now, the original domes were actually very low, almost flat on the outside, and so they were given these enormously tall superstructures over the top to make them resemble more the kind of burial structure that they felt St Mark would have had he been in Egypt, that was appropriate for him. And you can see here how this is constructed. The original profile of the church is like this, and these enormous outer bulbous domes with onions on top are placed on top as a sort of memory of this exotic funerary landscape of Cairo. Here you can see one of these being repaired, so you can see in a sense the way that the ones you saw in the last slide were stone, but this is a very similar kind of structure to these with a wooden frame. Oops, sorry, enthusiastic. So by this time, 13th century, Venice is very well established as a very important commercial power, importing Oriental goods from the Eastern Mediterranean to sell on in Venice, particularly to people from Northern Europe who would come down and buy stuff. They were not yet complete masters of the Mediterranean. The Genoese were their big rivals right through to the 14th century, but by the 15th certainly the Venetians were very much sort of in charge. Just to give you an idea of the kind of goods that were traded, the Venetians exported wool from Northern Europe and metals and wood and arms, which upset both the Byzantine emperors and the papacy. I mean, these stories of arms trade go on and on through all centuries, of course. The popes, in fact, tried to forbid the Venetians from trading with the Islamic world because they felt they might be exporting goods that could be used for arms, as indeed they certainly were. And in return they imported spices and silks and beautiful textiles, cotton, a sort of bulkier, less valuable product, Russian furs, which they got from the Black Sea, and slaves, who mainly came again from Central Asia. The Venetians tend to keep rather quiet about the slave trade, but they were actually quite active in that area. Now, of course, the most famous of these Venetian merchants is Marco Polo, who went all the way to China, and this is an illumination in a beautiful miniature illustrated version of Marco Polo's travels in Paris, where he's seen arriving at the court in Beijing, supposedly the court of the Yuan dynasty ruler, with his boat containing a camel and an elephant and a horse, which is quaint but unlikely. But the important thing is that under the Mongols, when the whole of China was unified, the Silk Route became much safer. The older Polo's trip to China, that's Marco Polo's uncle, was in the 1260s, and his departure was 1271. Most Venetian merchants didn't go nearly that far, and I actually think there's absolutely no influence of Chinese architecture in Venice at all. Most Venetians went probably as far as places like Tabriz in Iran, or down into Egypt, or Damascus, Constantinople, Black Sea, traded with middlemen who brought products from the east, either through the Red Sea or along the Silk Route. So the Venetians established a network of what they called colonies. Now, they're not what we would call colonies. They're not colonies in the sort of imperial sense. They're more like concessionary trading privileges, really. They would have a little quarter in each town where they were given the right to have a bakery, a fonduco, which was their sort of headquarters, a bathhouse. It's interesting, they weren't interested in bathing at all in Venice, but in the east they always had their bathhouse, and perhaps a chapel dedicated to St. Mark. And you can see in Acre, for example, that the Venetian quarter is actually this part here, right on the best harbour. This is north, is this way. So this is the main harbour of Acre, now called Acre, and the Pisans have this little tiny harbour there, and the Genoese don't even have any harbour at all. So they've got absolutely the best site, and the colony in Acre was extremely important. Now, thinking about how all this trade affected the architecture, we need to think a little bit about Venetian politics. In 1297, the Venetian merchant oligarchy closed itself with an official sort of decree and listed the families who were allowed to take part in government. And this is called the serrata, or the closing. In some ways, it isn't so much a closing as they're saying, you're the people who've got the right to vote and to take part in government, but you better show up and do it. In other words, it's part of it is giving these privileges so that people actually do take an active part in government, because they were having trouble getting enough people active in doing the job of running the country. But this meant that they needed a space for far larger numbers in the Doge's palace, that is to say, the palace of the elected ruler, the Doge, in the centre of the city. And in 1341, they decided to rebuild the main front towards the water, and the room for the Great Council to meet is the one that goes right across the top here, as far as there. So this great big room was the hall for this newly defined class. So what I think I want to look at is how in this building, which is so familiar now, we can hardly really analyse it, but I think if you do look at it carefully, you can see lots of things that suggest some quite interesting connections with the Eastern Mediterranean. And the first thing is that, again, there's a tremendously strong underlying Solomonic imagery. In one of the descriptions of Solomon's palace in the Bible, it's described as having big hewn stone blocks at the base and walls of fine dressed stone above, which is exactly what you've got here. 2 giant columns outside. Here's one of them. There's another one there. Solomon's own house was at the back of a courtyard, just as the Doge's palace was at the back of the courtyard. And the main meeting hall was panelled with cedar wood from the Lebanon, and indeed they went specially to Lebanon to get the cedar wood to panel the hall. So clearly people who knew the text describing Solomon's palace would see some sort of connections here. So again, as I've said, this would confer wisdom and justice on the Republic. But there are other sort of confusing things, because thinking that the Dome of the Rock was Solomon's temple, they then they believed that Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is next door, was Solomon's palace. Let's see if I can show you this. Let's go on to the next one. So this is what the Aqsa Mosque looks like. It doesn't look anything like that at all. But it was drawn at this time to look like that. So the person who drew it kind of misremembered it and drew this building, which you can see in this illumination, in a sort of map. It was done about 1320, so just before this. And so this is, in a sense, replicating a sort of flawed, incorrect memory of Al-Aqsa Mosque, thinking that it was the Palace of Solomon. So there's all kinds of confusions going on here. Another aspect which I think is very important is that the Mamluk sultans of this period were very powerful, very sophisticated and rich, and the Venetians, trading with Egypt, knew very well that this image of rulership conveyed by the Mamluk sultans was something rather desirable. And if you look at this building, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, here it was being drawn in the 19th century, the throne room of one of the most powerful of the Mamluk sultans, Al-Nasir Muhammad, actually has many aspects, again, that are very similar, with these pointed arches on the bottom and then smaller windows above and a row of crenellations across the top. So it's almost as if they're also trying to acquire the imagery of the Mamluk Sultanate. Now, the context of this is that they're actually under a ban from the papacy at this period for trading with the Islamic world. The poor merchants who did it were threatened with excommunication, which meant damnation and go to hell on their deaths. And there are tragic wills written in this period by merchants who, writing in this wonderful, expressive Venetian dialect about how they had to carry on trading, otherwise their family would starve, and they hoped God would forgive them, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the agenda behind all this borrowing of motifs from the East is to do with actually resisting the papacy and saying, look, we don't care what the Pope says. We want to go and carry on trading because this is how we make our living. And you can find all sorts of other connections, like, for example, the crenellations across the top are not crenellations that you could use to defend the building. I've walked up on the roof there, and I mean, you couldn't possibly pour boiling oil down or throw missiles or anything. It's very exposed. But it's very similar to the sort of cresting that was put on mosques at this period in Egypt. And I think people were familiar with this kind of ornament and would have recognised that that's what it was like. It's nothing like any kind of crenellations on a communal palace in Europe at this time. Likewise, this diamond sort of lozenge pattern on the upper walls is incredibly common on buildings in Central Asia at this time. This is the dome of the Great Mosque at Yazd, which is just before this, which has very much the same kind of design. And of course, designs like this could be easily transmitted on, just draw it on squared paper and bring it back. It's not hard to remember. Here's another example of this sort of decoration. And as I said, this is the period when the Silk Route was incredibly important. There was a Venetian consulate in Tabriz. There were, really a lot of direct knowledge of these sort of buildings. In fact, there was an Italian merchant's handbook published in 1340, which is just the year before this building's begun, which said that the road to China was safe by land, by night and day. So that's the sort of context of this. So moving on a bit, you can see how the Venetians are really beginning to cement their very powerful position as the main importers of Oriental goods into Europe. A fascinating example of this is this tombstone in China, in Yangzhou, of I think a Venetian woman, although the Genoese also claim her, I must say. She was called Caterina Villon. You can actually see this on the inscription. She died in China in 1342, and she was buried with this tombstone, which is absolutely like the Yuan dynasty Islamic tombstones of the same period. I'll show you one in a minute, except that, that it's got Christian subjects here. This is St. Catherine being martyred on her Catherine wheel. There she is being beheaded. This is the Virgin Mary. So again, it's a wonderful piece of cultural mixing. And if you go to what they call the Marco Polo Museum in Yangzhou, you can see her original, the original here on the left. And this is the sort of thing that Muslims in China were having for their tombstones at the same time. So the decoration is very, very similar. It's just that the lettering and the pictures are different. very curious that a woman should be going that far, because on the whole, Venetians traded leaving their wives at home to look after the children and the house and keep an eye on the family business. But one of the Venetian handbooks said it was a good idea to take a woman because it saved money on prostitutes when you were travelling in the East. Now, valuable goods were carried in these galleys, which are a very particular kind of ship that are rowed by hand. They did often have sails, but they're very manoeuvrable. So they don't have a lot of space inside them, but anything valuable like spices and rich textiles were carried in these special ships under armed convoy organised by the state. And there were two convoys each year. Once they invented the compass and could sail in the winter as well, they were able to do it twice. And so the whole trading business was very much done under the auspices of the Republic, because this was their whole identity and source of revenue. Now, I talked about how the Venetian ruling class created its identity in the Doge's palace. They also did this in their own houses. Now, here we get some very fascinating blurring of cultural identity. The Venetian merchants, somebody must have brought back one of these beautiful ceramic mihrab panels. There are several of them in Western museums, so certainly a lot of them did come west in the Middle Ages, and must have said to a mason, this would be a nice window, could you make one like this? Again, trying to sort of evoke Eastern connections, because that was the source of their trade and their income. And then it very quickly became absorbed into the visual culture. So if you look here, if you look here at this window, for instance, it's very, very similar, with a rectangular frame, and then this, in this case it's just a single arch. Here's a double one there, with what's called an ogee arch. That's a sort of four-centred arch, sort of slightly pointed at the top. Very similar to images of mihrab niches. Now, a mihrab, of course, represents light and paradise and all the sort of thing. You know that all about that much better than I do. And I've tried to sort of think whether one should sort of deconstruct this and think that the Venetians were thinking of their windows as representing paradise looking into the house, or paradise looking out of the house onto the city, or whether Mecca meant some kind of trading emporium, as it sort of does now. But I don't actually think any of these things are relevant. I think what happened was that the visual idea got absorbed quickly. People started copying each other, and it just became sort of retained in the language, just like an Arabic word might get preserved in the language. I mean, these things happen so quickly. When I was a child, spaghetti was an Italian word, but it's not anymore. It's just a normal word. So, you can see how this got sort of under the skin. And I think you need to remember that Venetian traders sent their young Venetian trading families, rich elite merchant families, sent their young men east to spend perhaps 2 years trading, learning to trade, learning accounting, learning Arabic, learning how to tell good spices from bad spices, all these kind of tricks that they need to learn, getting to know the customs and the way of life. So that when they were very impressionable, they would be subjected to the wonderful colours and smells and the rituals and the fantastic qualities of these great Eastern emporia, places like Damascus and Alexandria and so on. So, they at a very impressionable age, they were exposed to beautiful architecture and rich colours and rich decoration. If you go around these cities at the now, there's a lot of traditional domestic architecture, I think, has been lost. And this doorway in Alexandria was drawn by an Englishman called Briggs in 1925, I think it was. Well, I've been down, I think, every street in Alexandria. I never found this house, and I think it's just not there anymore. But I think that the memory can be transformed enormously, but in a sort of vague way, the memory of these kind of buildings was infused into Venetian domestic architecture, as actually John Ruskin, the English critic, recognised. He was the first person, I think, to explore the idea that there had been an Arabic influence in Venetian architecture. Interestingly, there's one particular building type that spreads all across the Mediterranean world in the late Middle Ages, and that's what the Venetians called the fonduco, which comes from the word funduc in northern Africa. Went by various names depending on where you were. So in Cairo it would be a wakala, a khan in Syria, a khan in Constantinople, a caravanserai if you were out in the desert. But these buildings had a cistern or some kind of water storage area in the middle. If they were on the sea, in Venice they didn't have animals, but I mean if you were in the east, you would certainly have stabling for animals as well, and then you'd have storage for your merchandise, and all the way around the top would be kind of hotel rooms for travelling merchants. And these two, one in Cairo and one in Venice, are built at almost exactly the same time. It's sunnier in Cairo, so there's more need for blinds and so on here, but actually I think you can see that the building types are very, very similar. There's one final, sorry, I've turned the thing upside down, little subject that I want to raise, which is the development of diplomacy, because the Venetians, with these resident quarters in the Eastern Mediterranean, very early established the idea of a consul or a resident ambassador in these countries with which they were trading. The consul, interestingly, couldn't dress in local clothes and travel around with merchants and go into the markets freely. He had to represent his own country, just as an ambassador does today. And he had to dress in the Venetian style. In fact, their possessions, inventories of their possessions, show that they had unbelievable numbers of formal robes, and they also had very well equipped kitchens, because they used to have suppers for the Venetian merchants who were there. But so from this grows a very sophisticated system of envoys who actually usually spoke a lot of languages, and the Venetians became very, very early, very good exponents of foreign diplomacy, particularly after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. This beautiful painting, dated 1511, now in Paris, shows the arrival or the welcoming of the Venetian ambassador in Damascus. And the view of Damascus is a wonderful sort of collage of all the different elements. So there's a minaret here, this is the Great Mosque. Pretty accurate picture of the Great Mosque, but all the elements are all in the wrong places. So there's a hammam, a bath. Here's a house with a terrace on top and a mashrabiyah in front of it. There's a beautiful garden. These are Mamluk emblems there. And this is the doorway into the souk, and lots of camels, obviously. This is, amalgamation of all the things people associated with Damascus. Poor Damascus. I'm so sad what's happening there now. Here's one of the most successful of the Venetian diplomats, a man called Giovanni Dario, who sent a Venetian painter to go and paint the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet II. This picture's now in the National Gallery in London. He obviously came back with having acquired, either by gift or by purchase, a lot of Oriental marble, and he decorated his palace with these wonderful marbles, and then in an inscription across the bottom, which you can't see there, he sort of dedicated it to the genius of the city. But he put his own name on it too, but I think he felt he should, it was a sort of diplomatic gift. So I just want to think finally about the sort of interpretations that viewers, particularly those who hadn't been East, might think of these sort of borrowings that we've looked at. Now remember that any merchant returning to the family would entertain the family with tales of their travels. So there's a sort of oral discourse in the house which would give verbal descriptions to children, to women, other people who couldn't travel. Now, women and even nuns, housewives, widows, could invest in trade, and they often did. Each trading voyage was a separate sort of limited company was made for each voyage. So there's a lot of direct involvement of women in trade, even if they didn't actually get in the ships and go. And so I think it permeates the whole society. Now, women on the whole were not free to wander around the city. They mainly stayed in their own parish. Certainly reputable women tended to stay in their own parish. But the men could move freely around the city, men of all classes, and it's a pedestrian city, so there'd be a lot of discussion about different in front of buildings and talking about them and discussing what they might mean. So I think you have to imagine people looking at the buildings and wondering, and you see this with travellers who try to interpret the iconography. So these are some of the things that I've sort of tried to suggest. First thing is, of course, to naturalise St Mark's relics. So looking at Alexandria and borrowing things to do with Egypt and Alexandria in particular, to create a kind of appropriate setting. And I mean, this goes on into the Renaissance. Alexandria had a very famous library. One of the most important projects in the Renaissance was to build a very fine library. Secondly, Jerusalem was an inspiration for Solomonic imagery to underline the virtues of justice and wisdom, which the Venetian Republic wanted to claim. Thirdly, and very, very important, is this sort of celebration of the material culture, the material wealth, and the success of their trading by alluding to Eastern connections. The final one, which I haven't talked about, is that the Venetians ran a sort of pilgrim travel agency, really. You could go to Venice and buy a place in a galley to take you off to the Holy Land, and when you got there, you'd have a guide and mules to take you around, and your accommodation be organised and all this sort of thing. It was very sophisticated travel business, very like what one might have today. And Venice therefore tried to fashion itself as a sort of outpost of this great pilgrim itinerary. So I think I hope that you can see that there's conscious emulation, and there's much less conscious emulation of simply Eastern culture being so blended in with everyday experience because of this constant inflow of goods and people and memories and so on from the East. But there's also a sort of blurring of boundaries, which I think made it very difficult sometimes for Venetians to recognise their own cultural debt to the Arab world. For example, if a Venetian went into a mosque, which is quite difficult to do, but they sometimes could if they dressed in the right way and got their friends to take them in, and they saw a mihrab, they would say, oh, that's like my house at home. So you get this sort of intertextuality and a cross-referencing that's very fascinating. So I'm sure you might have some questions. There are a lot of things to think about, and it's been a very, very quick sweep across the subject. But thank you very much for listening.